Americans have suffered under the highest inflation rates in the last 40 years, and unsustainable federal debt at $35 trillion and burdensome government regulations threatens to stifle economic growth. All factors leading to Donald Trump's election to the presidency. So, what is the path toward a healthier, more robust economy? What policies should the federal government pursue to increase economic growth and prosperity? Hi, I'm Richard Nelson, your host, and thank you for tuning in to the Commonwealth Matters. Joining us to talk further is Dr. Alex Salter, who's the George G. Snyder Associate Professor of Economics at Texas Tech University, where he also works with the Free Market Institute. Alex also has written several books and has published nearly 300 opinion pieces in leading national outlets such as the Wall Street Journal and National Review. Alex, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
Thanks, Richard. I'm really excited to be here.
Hey, we appreciate you joining us. I thought it'd be good to have somebody who's well-versed in economics and economic policy to talk about the changing of the guard, if you will, at the federal level. We have a new president coming in who largely campaigned on populist platform issues. For example, cutting an inefficient federal government, cutting taxes, imposing tariffs on other countries that are perceived as taking advantage of American workers. And I'm going to start with this, just the bloated, inefficient federal government, where if you pay attention to how much is spent by our federal government, how many federal workers we have, the amount of regulations at the federal level, you can make a case that the federal government has been a drag on economic growth. So federal spending in 2023 accounted for about a quarter of gross domestic product. That was $27 trillion total GDP, rough ballpark figure. And about a quarter of that $27 trillion was spent by the federal government. That included mandatory programs, Social Security, Medicare, defense spending. The costs, I'm going to add to this, the costs of regulatory compliance are about $2 trillion annually. That's according to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. That's 7.5% of gross domestic product. So you can make a case that the United States economy is on an unsustainable path. Now, Donald Trump has introduced what he's called, and actually on the campaign trail, he promised that if he was elected, he would institute something called the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, who it's being led by Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. And they're going in with a mindset to slash and cut unnecessary regulations and to cut unnecessary federal jobs and to cut in areas to bring down the overburdensome federal government. I think the number that was put out there was $2 trillion when Elon Musk said, how much can you cut from the federal budget? He said $2 trillion. So here's a question. I know I just put a lot out there to you, but where should DOGE begin? The Department of Government Efficiency, should they begin cutting the federal workforce or cutting regulations, or maybe the federal government should look at cutting taxes? Where would you begin if you were on the DOGE committee?
Great place to start. And I think that your premise is absolutely correct. The federal government right now is and has been for a while a drag on the U.S. economy. We are forsaking economic growth because the state at the national level has simply gotten too big, too bloated. It spends too much, regulates too much, and that stifles productive entrepreneurial activity. Government spending crowds out productive private spending. It redirects resources from capital markets where it would otherwise be invested for profitable purposes. And all these rules that are coming out of the administrative state aren't really doing anything other than stifling the economy and, of course, creating make work for bureaucrats. So in terms of what DOGE needs to do, in terms of what I would like to see from the Department of Government Efficiency, and let's remember that this is not going to be an actual government entity. It's going to be an advisory committee made up of, if it has employees, they are not going to be employees of the government. It's going to be something separate that makes recommendations to President Trump. I do think that we need across the board government cuts. And I also think that specific targeted programs should be cut much more deeply, if not eliminated entirely. One of the campaign promises that Donald Trump ran on was eliminating the Department of Education. Creating that department was a mistake. It has done more harm than good. Moving control of education policy and financing from the state and local level to the national level has not made education any better. In fact, it's made it worse. We're spending more and more to get, at best, no better educational results. And in many ways, education has gotten worse. And I think that there is a serious argument to be made that is causally related to bloated government controlling a process that's best left to state and local government, to say nothing of municipalities and families. We often forget that the most effective governing unit is the family itself. And I think that we need to rely more on those private mechanisms to actually revitalize national flourishing. And so I definitely want to see a repeal of federal rules. At minimum, I think that we need to see a slowdown in the rate of increase of government spending. I would be thrilled if we could actually get a cut in government spending, although that tends to be politically difficult. The silver lining is that the president-elect is constitutionally prohibited from seeking another term, which means he doesn't have to run for re-election again. He can do the difficult things that are necessary to do to even make some interest groups angry if he has to make sure that they don't get the funding that they're expecting. Because the simple fact of the matter is, when you add up all the spending at the state and local and federal levels, we're talking about something like 40% of GDP. That's just too much. The United States is supposed to be a free enterprise economy, and there's no reason for governments to be responsible for 40 cents on every dollar's worth of economic activity. If we do want to revitalize American prosperity, the jobs for that, the wealth for that, they're going to have to be created by the market. Governments are not very good at creating wealth. The market's good at creating wealth. Governments are very good at protecting wealth that's created, and we need to get the government back to its comparative advantage at enabling and protecting markets without trying to micromanage market outcomes.
That's good. Now, Alex, the plan of President Trump and Doge is ambitious. There are many detractors saying it can't be done. In fact, if you read much of the legacy news media is saying not only can't it be done, but the president doesn't have the authority to do it. People are expecting legal challenges. How do you begin? Now, of course, this is the executive authority over the executive agencies. Where do you begin? If you were on the Doge committee, somehow contributing your insight and perspective, where would you begin in anticipating lawsuits, anticipating this idea of the administrative state, government workers? They're trying to just preserve their jobs. It's, as you alluded to, it's not about efficiency, it's not about productivity, but it's just about self-preservation for many of them. And you have news media allies who are trying to throw a wrench into Trump's project here to cut back the government and the reach of government. But where would you begin anticipating this pushback? Again, you have threat of lawsuits, you have legacy media outlets that are against you. What would you advise, or where would you start?
I would proceed without being that afraid of any potential legal challenges to this. If people are going to sue, let them sue. The simple fact of the matter is Congress delegated this authority to the executive branch to create all these executive agencies and then have them write their own rules with minimal legislative oversight. Now, I think that that was a bad deal in the first place. I would actually like to make Congress great again. I think that legislators should stand up and say, no, we are the first branch among equals in this constitutional system, and it's our job to monitor and oversee even the executive branch. We often don't remember that the executive agencies are ultimately accountable to Congress. But the fact of the matter is Congress gave away that authority, and the courts have upheld it. So this is something that the president can do. The president can pause enforcement of regulations that he thinks are counterproductive pending review. The president can suspend a lot of regulations with executive order. The president can do a whole lot in terms of actually revamping the regulatory state. I don't know as much about the spending side of things. There's this whole debate right now going on over impoundment, where we're debating whether the president has the authority not to spend money that Congress has already appropriated. The last time that that was tried was during the Nixon administration, and Congress actually passed a law to get the president to stop doing that. That law has never been challenged, but there are many conservative legal philosophers and theorists who think that that act of Congress was itself unconstitutional because it trespasses on the separation of powers. So, in terms of spending, it's more of an uphill battle. You can always, of course, veto bad spending bills. That's something that the president can do, and I would like to see done if Congress isn't serious about restraining spending growth. But in terms of the challenges to controlling the federal workforce, in terms of the challenges to repealing regulations, I don't think that we have anything to be afraid of. We have the legal authority. The president can do it. And if it ultimately comes down to a lawsuit, I think that the Supreme Court is going to come down on the president's side. So in terms of paring back the administrative state, I say full steam ahead.
You had mentioned just a few moments ago that the president could cut the Department of Education, which is something that he promised to do on the campaign trail. To your point, education has not improved since the Department of Education came into existence under the Carter administration. Could this department be eliminated with the stroke of a pen by executive order, or would it take congressional action?
It can be significantly reoriented by the president, but I think to abolish an entire department, to get rid of basically a cabinet position, that would require an act of Congress. You would need Congress on board because it was an act of Congress that established the Department of Education, and I believe an act of Congress would be necessary to completely end it. Now, that doesn't mean that the president doesn't have a lot of wiggle room even without an act of Congress. Who you appoint as secretary obviously matters a lot. The kinds of policy priorities that you want to unleash matters a lot. For example, if you wanted to reorient the Department of Education away from what it's doing now, if you wanted to seriously explore, for example, a national school choice program, I think that that could be done with existing statute/legislative authority. But in terms of getting rid of it completely, yeah, you're going to have to get Congress to act on that. And I think that you could have some progress on that with the current Republican majorities, but I think it probably would take a little bit of pressure, if not strong arming, by the White House to make that happen. It's something that I seriously think that we should consider because the education department has not actually improved. In fact, it's worsened educational outcomes all across the country. This is really a great test case in the progressive theory of government. Jimmy Carter created the education department because he thought that having a single branch, a single agency of government responsible for overseeing education would actually increase efficiency. Before that, it was too decentralized. You had too many states, too many agencies doing their own thing. Create a one-stop shop, put everything there at the federal level. That should actually result in cost savings and efficiency for the American people. And in fact, the exact opposite has happened. It's become bloated. It's made it harder to actually educate our children. Funding is a mess. Rules that are being handed down from on high with no respect of the circumstances affecting actual communities are making it harder to produce and govern the educational process. This whole thing has been a mess. And so I definitely think that we should get rid of it and return those functions to the states. It's a matter of whether you can get Congress on board to do that. I'm hopeful, but by no means certain.
Kentucky is at a crossroads. We can choose to give in to the radical left, or we can choose to engage the culture in a God-honoring way.
I started the Commonwealth Policy Center because I believe that Christians have a responsibility to influence government and society to the glory of God. While the Commonwealth Policy Center's made a significant impact, our work isn't finished. If you'd like to join our movement working for timeless values, then head to our website.
To learn more, go to commonwealthpolicycenter.org.
If you're just joining us, you're tuned into the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson here with Dr. Alex Salter, who's an associate professor of economics at Texas Tech University. Alex, tariffs. Let's move on to this topic. Donald Trump shocked Washington back in June when he proposed to fund the federal government solely from tariffs. And that's how the government was funded about a century ago. Most of the federal revenue came from tariffs, foreign goods coming into this country. Now, you argued in a column in City Journal that the problem is that non-Americans largely do not pay for tariffs in the end. U.S. households and businesses do, in the form of higher prices and reduced trade. Then you went on to say the former president is relying on one of the oldest fallacies of folk economics. So, what's wrong with other countries uh, contributing more for us having a tariff on them for their right to sell in our country?
So I think that there are two related but nonetheless separate issues here. The first is it feasible to fund the federal government out of tariffs? And the short answer is nowhere near enough. The federal government is too big by at minimum a factor of 5 and maybe a full order of magnitude, maybe a factor of 10. Yeah, we did it that way a century ago, but what we forget is that a century ago, the federal government, as a fraction of all government expenditures in this country, including both state and local, was only 33%, a third. Two-thirds of government activity was state and local governments. Now that ratio has gotten flipped on its head. The federal government is two-thirds of all forms of government spending, and all state and local governments put together are only one-third. And so we've gotten totally top-heavy. The absolute size of government has grown. I think at most you could hope to get about 20% out of tariffs compared to what we're getting right now out of income taxes. And that's a very optimistic assessment by itself. So if we're serious about moving to this sort of a financing scheme, one of the things that would have to happen is that the federal government would have to massively shrink in size and scope. And let me be clear, I'm actually enthusiastic about massively shrinking in size and scope of the federal government. But I think that when many Americans sit down and look at the arithmetic and realize all the government services that would have to go away, they might not be so enthusiastic about that. The second question is, who actually pays a tariff? When we impose a tax on imports, who is ultimately paying that tax? And when you go and look at the economics of taxation, one of the first lessons that you learn is it doesn't really matter who is legally responsible for writing the check to the government, who's legally bearing the burden of a tax. Who ultimately pays a tax depends on who sticks around versus who leaves that market and goes to act in other markets that are not taxed. So what we're ultimately talking about here is consumer versus producer sensitivity to price changes. And when we're looking at imports, if we're importing manufactured goods from China, for example, the Chinese can sell to a lot of other countries. It's not like they have to sell to the United States. If we try and make it more expensive for them, they can easily find other customers. In contrast, it's comparatively more difficult for Americans importing Chinese goods to find domestic substitutes. Not that they don't exist, they do exist. And taxing imports will actually create an incentive to find some of those substitutes. But because it's easier for sellers rather than American households to switch their behavior, Chinese sellers can sell more easily to other countries, more easily than we can find other people to buy from. Because of that, American households and businesses are going to be left bearing the lion's share of that tax burden in the form of higher prices domestically and reduced trade. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't do it, right? You could have a very coherent national security objective when implementing tariffs. In fact, I'm an advocate of using tariffs and capital controls for the purposes of increasing national security. I would like to see, for example, much higher tariffs and much stricter capital controls on China and other authoritarian nations that are our rivals and have demonstrated a hostility to the United States. But the flip side of that coin is that I want unilateral free trade with our allies. I don't want any tariff on goods coming from Japan, coming from Great Britain, coming from Germany. And so I think that you can have an intelligent conversation about the use of trade policy to achieve geopolitical goals. But as an economic agenda, for example, for promoting domestic manufacturing, I don't think it works very well. It's not that I don't want to see more manufacturing in the United States. I just think that trade restrictions are a bad tool for achieving that objective. I think that we can more easily rely on trade restrictions to disentangle the American economy from the Chinese supply chain. There's a reason that we don't want a communist rival making up a critical part of U.S. supply chains. Even if we have to switch to something that's marginally more expensive, we're safer and freer if we're not reliant on China.
Alex, the conservatives who, like you and me, who would be listening to this conversation say that makes so much sense. Get rid of the loopholes, get rid of the burdensome regulations. Let's get it to a place where we report, here's how much we made, and here's how much we owe. Here's the tax bracket that you're in, a flat tax. That makes sense. There are many conservatives who run on that platform, but like you mentioned earlier, they get up to Congress, they get elected, and they start serving, and then they start changing their tune. What's it going to take for Americans to have significant change with something like the IRS? What was it going to do? Maybe we're just electing the wrong people, or I don't know. Where do we begin with that? Because it will take an act of Congress to change the IRS tax code.
Yes, it will. One of the most depressing public opinion stats that I've seen is not, in fact, how unpopular Congress is. Like, Congress is legendarily unpopular. It has like a 30% approval rating. It's the conjunction of that with people's opinion of their own representatives and senators. They all love their own congressperson and they all love their own senator. So it's all the other guys that are bad. Now, the fact of the matter is, you need to actually realize that your congressman and your senator are part of the problem, almost certainly. So you can't have this low opinion of the institution while continuing to insist that your guy is just the bee's knees. If you are not willing to throw out the person that you elected because they're not working on the bills and pushing the bills that they're supposed to be working on and pushing, stop complaining. Stop accepting, oh, well, I thought that we wanted to do this, but then I got to Washington and I learned that that's just not how we do business. It needs to be the way that we do business. If you ran on something and then you don't advance that issue when you get to Washington, what are you doing there? So this is one issue where I don't blame the Congress critters and I don't blame the Byzantine structure of the federal government. If you want to know the problem here, look in the mirror. Citizens are far too unwilling to send people packing who they previously elected. Incumbency rates are far too high. If somebody runs on fiscal reform and then doesn't even try and advance a bill doing that, they need to be shown the door. There needs to be an incentive for even young new members of Congress to upset the seniority system, right? Because one of the things that we hear is, well, I wanted to get this bill filed. I wanted to move this piece of legislation, but the relevant committee sat on it. They wouldn't move it. I don't have the seniority to challenge it. So right now, all I have to do is wait. Make some noise. It's not like you like a podium. It's easier than ever to raise a stink about something. The reason that they don't do that is they want to play nice with the powers that be so that they can end up with a cush position on one of these committees someday. Look, I understand the importance of institutions. I understand the importance of not burning down the whole thing and hitting the reset button, right? We're conservatives. We understand the value of established ways of governing. That's what makes a conservative a conservative. But conservatives are also supposed to be open to reasonable reform. Conservatism doesn't mean no change. Conservatism means change when it is necessary in accordance with eternal values and principles. Good government is an eternal value and principle. And if the way of doing business, if the committee structure of hierarchy of time serving has become an impediment to actually delivering results for the taxpayers and citizens, guess what? It's the processes and institutions that need to change, not the taxpayers and citizens. We, the people, are the sovereign, and we've had enough.
I want to end with this. We're running out of time, Alex. Does Trump and his new administration, especially with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is there a chance that they roll back the scope and size of our federal government here in the next 4 years?
I think that there is a high likelihood that they are going to make recommendations to the president that will do that. That's what they're there for. One of the great things about not being officially a part of government is that they have that freedom to propose things that are going to be massively unpopular, especially among the career civil service. So whether the president actually acts on those recommendations, whether the president is able to build a coalition in the legislature to actually get bills passed in support of these things when actual legislation is needed, that's the wild card. Because it's actually pretty straightforward to come up with a list of things that need to be pared back or outright eliminated. The reason that you could spend 80-hour weeks doing that is simply because there's so much nonsensical stuff the federal government is doing. And so I fully expect Elon and Vivek to come up with a solid list. Where the rubber hits the road is where President Trump wants to prioritize in terms of turning those proposals into actual action, into concrete reforms. Hopefully there's a lot of stuff in there that the president currently can act on legally. Hopefully also the president is willing to spend a little bit of political capital to line up people in Congress, in the House and in the Senate, to do the more heavy lifting, right? The things for which you simply can't do without an act of Congress that results in a bill that the president can sign to change the law of the land. And so always, always the problem here comes with actual implementation, because that's where the political horse trading needs to happen. Politics is about ideas, it's about principle, it's about high matters like that, but it's also about interests. It just is. It always has been and it always will be. And what Doge proposes is probably going to result in a lot of people's oxes being gorged. And so we need to ask, how is the president going to be able to build a coalition that can take that proposal and get it across the finish line, given how many vested interests it will doubtlessly anger? The president has a reputation as a deal maker. He has a lot of people that I think that he can rely on. He's building a cabinet. The conservative movement has a much larger philosophical breadth than it did just a couple of years ago. And so you have many more stakeholders. That has benefits in the sense that you can get a variety of perspectives. It also has costs in the sense that there's likely to be a little bit more infighting in terms of whose ultimate agenda is going to prepare. The optimism that I have is that we seem better positioned now to get these reforms than we have been in any time since Reagan's second administration, where it could have happened, but unfortunately it didn't happen. And again, the reason for that is you have a president who has a popular mandate, who is term limited, doesn't have to run for re-election, and a lot of the legwork is actually being done by allies out of the formal governmental process.
Alex Salter, Associate Professor of Economics at Texas Tech University. It's been a joy to have you join us on the Commonwealth Matters.
This was a lot of fun, Richard. Thank you for having me.